I'd like to, without any further ado, go ahead and present to you our first speaker, who's going to be Dr. Scott Burns, Geology Department at Portland State University. I have a little short bio of him. I've known him for many, many years. He's a good colleague and friend. He's been teaching for the last 41 years, 21 years at Portland State, others at Switzerland, New Zealand, Washington, Louisiana, and Colorado. He received his BS and MS from Stanford and his PhD from Colorado. He's past chair and past president of the Faculty Senate at 3 different universities, which tells you something about how much patience he has. He's a specialist in geological hazards and mapping of these hazards. He's a registered geologist, certified engineering geologist. He's an LG, LEG, PhD, and he's got a whole bunch of other labels that I'll let you read. So without any further ado, Scott Burns, ladies and gentlemen.
And then, I like that. Well, thank you very much, Franz. And I get to lead off the whole show tonight, talk a little bit about what earthquakes are and our environment. We live on a plate boundary. And so earthquakes are part of our life here. And so I'm talking a little bit about earthquakes in Oregon, past, present, and future. And so we're going to be doing the same thing tonight, but focusing more on the infrastructure in all of the talks after me. So we could say the City of Roses is also the city of volcanoes. And by the way, none of our laser pointers are going to work because all of the projections come from the back. And so the laser pointers are absorbed once they get into the screen. So I apologize for that. So we also have a city of volcanoes. Why do we have a city of volcanoes? Well, the reason is we are on a plate boundary. So what is an earthquake? When rocks are put under stress, they will bend, and then eventually break. When they break, they liberate a lot of energy. That energy creates wave energy that goes through the ground, and that's the earthquake that we deal with. And so the place that it actually breaks is called the focus. The point directly above that is the epicenter. And so anytime that there is an earthquake, they will always say the epicenter is at such and such a place with the depth below, and they will also give a magnitude, which I'll talk about. Every year in the world, we have over 800,000 earthquakes that we have. 100,000 are actually felt, 1,000 cause damage, and then 10 of those are major disasters. We've had quite a few just in the last few years. Last 4,000 years, we have had 13 million deaths and averaging about 10,000 deaths a year. This is one of these geological hazards that comes unannounced. And so what we need to do is be prepared for that, and that's what we're trying to do. That we have a lot of catching up to do here in Oregon, as you will see later on. Just in the last 2 years, we have had many, many different earthquakes. It started just last year with Haiti. It was only a 7.0 earthquake, but it was in a country with very, very few building codes, and we had over 200,000 people that were dead there. And then Chile had an 8.8 earthquake. This is a subduction zone earthquake, similar to what we're going to be talking about, the big one here in just a second. 7th largest one since the seismograph was invented, and 800 dead, and then a tsunami. Then followed by Turkey, a 6.0, and then Baja, a 7.2. Sumatra had a 7.7. Christchurch, where I used to live, 7.1, and then followed later on by a 6.3, 180 dead in that one. And then Japan, which just occurred 2 months ago, and earthquakes have been on the radar screen here in the Pacific Northwest. The Japanese earthquake, which you're going to hear a little bit more about later on. 9.0, 4th largest earthquake since the seismograph was invented. Again, a subduction zone earthquake with a tsunami. So we're very, very concerned about these. When geologists talk about magnitudes, what does that mean? And so many of you remember back to the spring break earthquake that we had in 1993. That was a 5.6 magnitude. If you go from 5.6 up to 6.6, it's a logarithmic scale with a fudge factor that is thrown in, and about 30 times the amount of energy is liberated in the 6.6 versus the 5.6. And then when you go from a 6.6 up to a 7.6, and you compare it back to that 5.6, that is 30 times 30, or 900 times the amount of energy. Or if we go up to an 8.6, which would be a subduction zone level 1, it would be 27,000 times the amount of energy that is liberated in that particular case. Two things that I always tell my students is numbers are in the newspaper. Generally, if it's below 2.5, nobody's going to feel it, even if you're directly over at the epicenter that you have. I love it. The Oregonian Prince. Well, Clatskanie had a 2.1 last night. Well, shoot, the people in Clatskanie didn't even feel that one. And so it's insignificant, but it's telling us and reminding us that we are in earthquake country. But above 5.5, especially in North America, that gets significant because that's where you start getting significant damage that is there, and so we have to pay attention. In between those, it is just reminding us that it is earthquake type of country in those areas. Why do we have earthquakes? Well, if we go back 200 million years ago, all of the continents were together in a big supercontinent that we call Pangaea. Then it started breaking up. Why did it break up? Well, there are places where the crust is very weak. Magma is coming up from down in the mantle to the surface, and it comes up and attaches itself to the plates. And then more magma comes up, forcing the plates away to the side, each of those. And eventually, the two major plates are moving away from that area. Many of these areas are in the middle of the oceans. These are what we call the ridge systems. And that is... So the Earth is dynamic. Everywhere you are on the face of the Earth is going to be moving in one direction or another. We're moving at about 4 centimeters a year in that direction. We're on the North American plate. Off the coast, we have the Juan de Fuca plate that is also coming back just about that same velocity. If we map all of the major earthquakes in the world, you can see that there are direct bands out there that we have got. Those are plate boundaries, where plates are moving away from one another, plates are moving and running into one another or by one another, for instance, down in California. And so we are at one of those plate boundaries. And if you look at a map of the world, we are on the North American plate. And again, my laser pointer is going to die. Well, it's right in here. We are moving in a westerly direction, but see there's a couple little red zones right down in here. That's the remnant of the much larger plate that we call the Farallon plate that used to be subducting underneath North America. And so we have off the coast, about 200 miles off there is a whole line of volcanoes out there generating a new plate that is moving in an easterly direction about 4.5 centimeters a year. That's about as fast as your fingernail is growing. And then it's being subducted, it's plunging down underneath North America and then coming back to the surface as the beautiful volcanoes that we have all the way from Mount Garibaldi up in British Columbia all the way down to Northern California and Mount Lassen. And where the two plates are moving by one another, or that is building up pressure, and that's going to be the site of our subduction zone earthquakes coming up in a second. So here is a cross-section of the Juan de Fuca plate, the Gorda plate, which is the southern extension there, plunging down underneath North America, and then uplifting the marine sediments along the coast, and then also creating the Cascade Mountains. This is a map, earthquake hazard map of the United States that was in the textbook when I moved back to Portland in 1990. And this is based on historical earthquakes. And if you look at Oregon up there, it says minor. Earthquakes were not on the radar screen at that particular time. And why? Because we have not had any historical big earthquakes. Now we have evidence in the geological environment that we'll talk about in a second. This is what the earthquake hazard map looks like today. And the whole Oregon coast is red and orange and yellow and coming in. All the way up to the Cascade Mountains. Why the change? Well, we started reading the geological environment and adding all of that information in there. But what did that do to the building codes? We didn't have any building codes before 1988 dealing with earthquake hazards, and in fact, really not much before 1994, and I'll just mention that. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about that tonight. What are the hazards that we have around here for earthquakes? We have 4 major ones here in Oregon. Number 1, ground shaking, and then the thicker the sediment underneath. As the earthquake waves go through, they're going to have great effect upon the structure, but the thicker the sediments underneath, the more amplification of those particular waves. Number 2, liquefaction. Along the rivers where you have high water table, sandy parent materials, that solid ground, when it's shaken at high vary amounts, it will turn into a liquid and flow. Number 3, landslides. Steep slopes, especially if they are wet, they shake. Those are going to be triggers and cause landslides. And then fourthly, along the coast, tsunamis. Just showing you a couple pictures. Here is shaking. This is in China. The building codes were not very strong in this particular area. The building collapsed. Here is a picture from Mexico City earthquake, very large one in the 8s back in the mid-1980s. And what you're looking at is a maternity hospital. And you see the 9th floor, the 8th floor, the 7th floor, the 6th floor, the 5th floor, the 4th floor. And as the rescuers were taking floor off after floor off, they could hear babies crying down in there. All of the workers for one whole week cried nonstop in that particular case. The whole thing pancaked down. This is something that we want to prevent. Also, liquefaction. A very famous place just outside of Anchorage, Turnagain Heights, occurred in 1964. The Good Friday earthquake, another subduction zone earthquake that we had there. There is a layer underneath the area called the bootlegger clay. On top of it is a sand. The bootlegger clay holds up a lot of water in the sand, and it's that sand that actually liquefied, and the whole housing development, 75 houses, slid right down into the Cook Inlet in downtown Anchorage. Looked like this as it was sliding down the hill. Liquefaction, with this shaking, all of the water that is in between those pores then tends to flow, and so this is what we're very concerned about. Where are we going to have areas like that in Portland? The whole area out along the Columbia River where the airport is, Swan Island, and along the Willamette River. Those are some of the highly prone liquefaction areas. Anytime there's a hole in the ground, we geologists are out there to take a look at that. And so when the Costco store went in over in Tigard, we started looking in the sides and we saw these big cracks, which you can see going up here, filled with sand. Why? Because below the parking lot area, that was a sandy area full of lots of water, and it liquefied. Sometime in the past, the sand followed the cracks all the way up to the surface and probably produced a sand boil that is no longer there. Niigata, Japan, some of the most famous photos in the world of well-built apartment house buildings, but the ground underneath them liquefied, they tilted over, and the effects you can see there. Landslides, this occurred in 1991. This was in the Coast Range. It was not earthquake generated, but if we have a major earthquake, subduction zone earthquake, and especially if it occurs in the wintertime, all of the roads going down to the coast are going to have many landslides like this closing down the roads. And then we have tsunamis along the coast, and we're going to be talking more about this later on. And we have two types of tsunamis, distant ones, and we dealt with that with the Japanese earthquake just 2 months ago, and then ones that are generated when we have the big one on the coast. And I tell people here, when I give talks on the coast, if you're knocked to the ground, the shaking doesn't stop for 2 to 3 minutes, you know that it's a subduction zone earthquake. You got 20 minutes to get to high ground. And so all up and down the coast now, we have signs saying you are entering a tsunami hazard zone, you are exiting a tsunami hazard zone, and then when you're in it, where the tsunami hazard zone evacuation routes happen to be. Building codes are going to be incredibly important. Here is a before picture and an after picture in northern Africa after an earthquake. And the building had no earthquake building codes in it at all. Many of the engineers are going to be talking about that tonight, so they are very important. Also, fire is such an important factor and another hazard in the earthquakes we have to worry about, especially 1906 earthquake that we had down in San Francisco. How about earthquakes in the past? Well, the seismograph was invented in 1880. Or 1870. And so we had the Port Orford earthquake was 6.3, but if you look up here, there are not a really large number of earthquakes. In fact, the largest one that was felt that caused the most people to die was 1949. And in Portland, we had 10 or 11 people killed. My old high school, Beaverton High School, the third floor was condemned because of that. And I still remember 1962 being at a Boy Scout meeting when we had the 5.2 earthquake. I'd never even heard of an earthquake. And the concrete floor was just looking like this, and the ceiling was going back and forth. We all said, we're going to die. What's happening? Our scoutmaster explained to us it was an earthquake and went on. And I don't remember anything about that afterwards, but that was pretty significant. And then 5.6, the wake-up call for Oregon. What did it do? It knocked the Oregon Pioneer off of the pedestal down in the state capitol, and they finally started putting money into earthquake hazard mapping in the state. Here's a map of the state of Oregon and all the major faults that we have found so far. We haven't found all of them. But do we know if they're active or not? No, most of them we don't. We don't know when the last one went off, or what's the recurrence interval, or what's the size of the earthquakes to expect. In California, they're miles ahead of us. They have the Alquist Priolo system that has all of that locked in. So we have a long way to go. And in Oregon, we have to worry about 3 different types of earthquakes. Earthquakes that are on the faults in the North American plate, like we had right there. Secondly, out in the Juan de Fuca plate, which is off of the coast. And then thirdly, where the 2 plates lock up as one goes out underneath the other. And that's where, when it breaks, the actual lock zone may be 40, 50 miles wide, and it may be as long as 5, 6, 7, 800 miles. And when it breaks from Northern California up to British Columbia, it can generate up to a 9.0 and above. And so those are the 3 different types of earthquakes that we have to worry about here. There is the Oregon State Capitol with the Pioneer. In 1993, they closed it down for 1 year because the Pioneer got knocked off. Dogami, our state geological survey, got a lot of money to make great earthquake hazard maps, which I'll end up talking about in just a second. Here's the old seismogram here at Portland State. And the paper, now it's all electronic. You can just log on from your home and just see what the seismograph is. Bob Butler down here from the University of Portland, he has an excellent site too, looking at that. But let's focus in on these subduction zone earthquakes that we have got here. And the last one, based on sediments that we find in the bays along the coast, the last one was 300 years ago, then before that 800 years ago, before that 1100 years. And so the recurrence interval that Kurt Peterson put together many years ago was 450 to 500 years. We have now refined that a little bit. And so here is a typical area, and this is down in Netart's Bay, and you can see the top of the salt marsh right down there, and then it goes down, and then there's an indentation. That's a sand layer. And then there's a black zone. That's a buried soil. That one was originally up at the surface. Anytime we have a subduction zone earthquake, the coast drops 1 to 2 meters. And so that whole area dropped down, and then it was buried by a lot of mud over the next 200 to 300 years. And the sand that was created by the tsunami that went over the spit came in and deposited on the top of the bay. And so Kurt in Oregon, Brian Atwater up in Washington, cored all of the bay areas and getting all these buried soils, and that's how they put together the recurrence interval for Oregon, Washington, and Gary Carver down in California. And you look up in the cliffs. This is down at Ecola State Park. You can see the black and white layers that are up there. This has been going on for thousands of years. But a great study has been done by Chris Goldfinger, who's a geology professor down at Oregon State. He went off of the coast and bored down into the sediments at the edge of the continental shelf. And every time there's a subduction zone earthquake, there'll be landslides that are going down to the bottom and then buried it, and you date those. And he did this, and he found 34 events in the last 10,000 years, and he drilled from Northern California, Southern Oregon, Central Oregon, Oregon, Washington, all the way up to British Columbia. 19 of these, he found the same event in each one of the holes. And then there were much more down in Northern California as you're coming up. So I won't go into this more in depth, but the bottom line is his recurrence interval is for up the Washington coast about every 600 years. The whole thing breaks from one end to the other. The Northern Oregon coast, 480 years, but the Southern Oregon coast, 287 years. Now, when was the last one? Brian Atwater published a book called The Orphan Tsunami, and he found great records in Japan that tell us that there was a large earthquake, a large tsunami that hit on January 26th, the year 1700. 2 meters high from one end of the country to the other end of the country, and it was generated by, we think, our tsunami here, because the dates, approximately 300 years old dates, were showing up. And so Chris says for the Northern Oregon coast, we have a 15% chance in the next 50 years. That's based on this 500 to 600 year recurrence interval. But for Southern Oregon, he puts it at 37%. The Oregonian newspaper this morning misquoted the recurrence interval. She used it for the whole area. And so, in our lifetime, do you think that we're going to have it up, the whole thing breaking? I don't think so. But I think we have a very, very strong chance for having one break on the southern part which won't be as big, but it still will shake us here. In Portland, we have 3 or 4 major faults. The Portland Hills Fault, right at the base of the mountains that you can see up there. And then on the East Bank, we have the East Bank Fault. Over Sylvan, we have the Oatfield Fault. In cross-section, you can see what they look like here. Anytime in nature you see a straight line, like you do at the bottom of the mountains there, you know that it is probably a fault. This is one of our state geological survey, Dogami's earthquake hazard maps. It's how are the soils responding to the shaking. Doesn't matter if it's a subduction zone earthquake or a Portland Hills Fault, it is going to, how is it going to respond? The red areas, and they're looking at the 3 major hazards that we have got. The liquefaction, the landslides. You can see in the West Hills, the red zones are primarily from landslides along the rivers. Those are primarily liquefaction. And I love it. And then you see Alameda Ridge in North Portland. That has the lowest area there. But if one geological hazard doesn't get you, another will. And that's your highest area of radon. So radon will get you instead of earthquakes. We have a lot of building codes that we're going to be talking about, the epitome of buildings built for earthquakes, the Transamerica building down in San Francisco. I just wanted to show you the 2 major ones. 1988, that's when we went from Seismic Building Code 1 to Seismic Building Code 2, 2B. Geologists had bumper stickers, and so did engineers. To be or not to be? That is the question. And then eventually in 1994, then we switched to Seismic Building Code 3. Now we're in the International Building Code. We're much more prepared today than we were many, many years ago. Our schools are now doing earthquake drills. What are they doing wrong here? They aren't holding on. And so we should be duck, covering, and holding, and something that is very, very important. And so just to summarize what we have got, important things that I would just like to leave you with. In earthquake insurance, I think is very, very important. I have it on my house, and I think maybe most people should have that too. Oregon is much more prepared today than we were in the early 1990s. It wasn't even on the radar screen. All of our, the American Cross, the hospitals, the police, the fire departments are much, much more prepared than we were. We go through many, many drills, and so, but we still have a long way to go. And think of what the Japanese earthquake did, and use of the reverse 9/11 on the coast, and where it worked and where it didn't. Incredible. Stilt houses, the engineers will talk you a little bit more about that later on, but the important things are you prepared at home? Are you prepared in your neighborhood? We can still not predict them. We're still working on them, but we're hopeful that sometime, maybe in our lifetime, we'll do a better job. Thank you very much for the chance to introduce this thing, and now we've got a lot of other great speakers coming up. So thanks.